Hello, everyone. So today, or this week, we're going to be looking at the United States after World War II. So this is a time of prosperity, but also growing tension and change that we're seeing. And so that's why it's labeled Troubled Innocence. And this is from 1945 to 1961 that we're covering in this chapter. I do want to mention, as we move through chapters 25, 26, and 27, we're going to go back and talk about the African American civil rights. And we're going to also start talking about the Chicano movement and the American Indian movement. So it's brought up in this chapter, but it is extended over the 1950s, the 60s, and then we pick up some other movements in the 60s and into the 70s. So we started here, but we're going to continue talking about it as we move forward in history in this course. So just a heads up. So peacetime transition and economic boom is what we're going to be introduced to the first part of chapter 25. And after World War II, the U.S. faced some major challenges, reintegrating millions of veterans into society. And programs like this one pictured here, like the GI Bill, helped a lot of veterans go to college, buy homes, and also get business loans. And that's going to fuel a lot of economic growth. By the 1950s, our economy was again booming. And if you will recall from previous history classes, the 1930s, that was the time of the Great Depression. Then World War II hits, and that helps bring us out of the Depression. So by the 1950s, 20 years later, we are seeing the economy rising, doing really well. The middle class is going to expand in the 1950s, and Americans were buying cars, televisions, new homes, and other material things. Suburbs are growing really rapidly too, but this prosperity was not shared equally. So really, it's your white middle class that is growing and getting to share with this new booming economy. Many African Americans were excluded through practices like redlining. And it's not just African Americans, it's Hispanics and it's indigenous as well. So let's look at this. So economic growth, gross national product per income. So the nice thing is our income is on the rise, and so is the economy as well. So they're kind of going hand in hand. So prices are going up, but so is the standard of living in the 1950s, and so is income is on the rise as well. So it's nice. It's not where everything is more expensive, like gas and food and housing, and our paychecks are stagnant. We're not getting raises in our pay, kind of like it is now. We see everything, including income, everything is rising together. Also, these are the boomer generation because there was a baby boom, and that's why there's this boom in our population. Happens really at the end of the war from 1945 to 1960. We have the boomer population, and everybody's having babies because everybody's coming home from the war. There's also a push to have children because we're anti-communism and we can beat the commies by having these good Christian nuclear families, right? This is an example of the redlining that's going to happen in Levittowns, and we will get more into that. But you notice this couple is minority. They're African American, and that's really important when we start talking about redlining, especially with Levittowns. Let's talk about the 1950s culture. I'm just going to introduce it to you. You're going to read all about it. But in the 1950s, it's often seen as a time of stability and conformity, and television really does help promote these families, like the ideal family, traditional gender roles, and then consumer lifestyles. Not everyone fits this mold though, right? Teenagers developed their own culture, and that was a new word that came about during the 1950s is the word teenager. Especially, we're going to see them, acting their own way and developing their own culture, especially through rock and roll. Women were encouraged to stay home, but that is just not a reality for women. A lot of women were going to have to go and find jobs. And I think you will read in this chapter, it talks about mental health was not a big thing, but you can pick up on things about why men are not working as much. But also women went into the workforce because all the men were gone during World War II. A lot of them were being turned out of the workforce, but they needed that second income because a lot of men coming back had PTSD and they couldn't handle the stressors and returning to civilian life. So a lot of them were also losing their jobs. But in order to live this ideal lifestyle, a lot of women do have to go out and find work, especially minority women, right? Because minority men are being paid less than their white counterparts. Also, the Beat generation. See if I can find the Beats for you. The Beat generation, you're going to read about them. They rejected conformity and they also criticized consumer culture. And at the same time, the civil rights movement is beginning to gain momentum. But I do want to point out the civil rights movement did not begin in the 1950s. If you want to argue, and there's different time points in history when a lot of historians will argue the beginning of the civil rights movement. My argument is that it started with the creation of the NAACP in the early 1900s. Some historians will go back and argue, well, it really started like 1619 when the first Africans arrived on American soil. Others will argue it really started in 1865 when you had, the 13th Amendment. So it depends on the historian, and there is excellent arguments for all those time points in history. I just would argue my argument is with the creation of the NAACP, because we start to see some court cases really changing things for the better. Before that, we did have court cases, but they weren't always in favor of African Americans. So you will see African Americans using different strategies to really challenge segregation, and they're going to build off of some court cases that set the precedent, some Hispanic cases and some Mexican American cases that set the precedent for them. But with African Americans, they have some major legal victories like Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, declaring that school segregation was unconstitutional, and that is a huge win. And that's when a lot of people are going to argue the beginning of the African American civil rights movement. Also, you're going to have direct action like the Montgomery bus boycott. These women here are boycotting the bus, but this is going to show the power of organized protests. You're going to have leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who promoted nonviolence and collective action. You're also going to have those that are militant and will actually promote more of a violent stand. Guys like Malcolm X, and Malcolm X, before he dies, he does switch over to a nonviolent stance. But you're going to see both sides of the coin there, right? Resistance to this movement by whites is especially strong in the South, where it is still very racist today. I can say that because I'm from the South. I grew up in the South, and I can attest to the racism that is still there today. Here are some sit-ins. You're going to have a quiz over the sit-ins, so just make sure. I think it looks a little bit different, but it's the same concept. I think the colors, it's like squares and diamonds and circles. It's not everything's a circle. Also, this might look kind of familiar and kind of sound familiar of what's happening in this picture. This is known, and I am not kidding on this is known as Operation Wetback. And this is when Mexicans were rounded up and they were sent back across the border. And you're going to read why this is so devastating, especially to our agriculture. But also, not all of these people that are rounded up were actually illegal immigrants. They were actually Mexican American. They were born in the United States, but because of the way that they looked and the language that they spoke, they are discriminated against and rounded up and sent back across the border. Sounds very familiar. But what we see is Dwight Eisenhower, and you'll read here around like the mid-1950s, Dwight Eisenhower really took a modern approach to governing, and he expanded the infrastructure through the interstate highway system and maintained a lot of the New Deal programs that we saw Roosevelt put into place, which we didn't cover, but you can go back and I believe you can read about those in chapter 22, I think is the New Deal. If you want more information about like what exactly was he keeping in place. But while he supported some civil rights efforts, his administration moved very cautiously. And it's not until we have, let me back up a little bit, not until we have this guy come in that we're going to really see a lot of big strides made with civil rights, because he makes friends with African Americans. And we have a lot of African Americans who supported Kennedy. So the 1950s, they're not just about a time of prosperity. It's really a time in our history where it was a turning point. So keep in mind what you read about in chapter 24, what was going on with, we still have the Red Scare that's happening in the 1950s. We still have communism that's happening. We still have a lot of fear about what could happen if an atomic bomb is dropped on the United States. But at the same time that's happening, we also have like this boom time that is happening. So this chapter really talks about the internal struggles that are happening, and kind of ignores the external things that were happening around the world, unlike chapter 24, which really focused on that. So beneath the surface of all this economic growth, though, there's some problems within United States culture, right? Americans were beginning to challenge all the inequality that is happening, the conformity and the injustice that's being carried out. And these challenges, that's going to define the decades to come. So again, as you read through this is just like scratching the surface of the civil rights movement and movements that are going to happen among African Americans, among Chicanos. It's going to be a new term that's coming out among the American Indian movement, among other groups that are marginalized in U.S. history.